almost all like the $100 billion companies that's been built in the last decades are in the US, right? And if you talk to the best funds in Silicon Valley, they will be, what is your vision for building a multi-billion-dollar company? And how can you connect that somehow to reality? We want developers to know Netlify and to have it in their tool belt. As a developer, the core thing you have to be good at is to constantly learn and adapt. There isn't really any real programmers out there that fundamentally knows what they're doing. Everybody's just figuring out their shit.
How do you make creating websites easier? Well, Netlify wasn't the first to try, and Mathias knew it. So what did they do? They created Jamstack, an approach to architecture anyone could use. It paid off big time. Netlify raised funding from the founders of Heroku, Rackspace, and GitHub, and it went on to do more than $30 million in revenue. In this podcast, my co-host Mia and I sit down with Mathias as he shares his story, the story of Netlify, a company born out of the open source community. By the way, this podcast is sponsored by our own ScaleUp for ScaleUps, InfoBeep. More on that later.
Hi, Matt. Today we're at Shift Miami conference, and you'll be talking about Jamstack. That's the term you actually coined.
Yeah, it is.
For our non-technical audience, can you explain what it is?
I'll do my best. It's a very technical term at the core of it because it really describes like an architecture for how developers build on the web. But in short, if you imagine that like in the old world before Jamstack, every single website you visited or every single e-commerce store or application was built as one big monolith, one big box of stuff where the user experience layer and the business logic and the data access and everything was coupled together. The idea with the Jamstack was to say, let's split that into different parts. Let's take the actual user experience that you interact with and separate it from all the business logic and all the data access and so on. So teams of developers can focus on just building really great user experiences with a tool set that's optimized for how you build those user experiences. Before that, often, if you were a developer working on that user experience, your whole tool set would typically be dictated to you by the choice of content management system or business logic systems that your backend engineer had picked, right? Like, so one of the big ideas here was let's separate those concerns so everybody can get the best-in-class tools. And then let's also split up that monolith on the backend and slice it into different services, different APIs, you call them, that you can reuse between companies, right? Like, so we saw this whole emergence of what you call headless content, where companies like Contentful or Prismic or Content Stack or Sanity and so on today are offering like everything you need to manage content in a company in its own little box that's separate from your business logic or for your billing engine or for your pricing system. And we saw companies like Commerce Tools or Commerce Layer, so on, offer e-commerce engines for doing all like the transactions and the shopping carts and so on, separate from all the rest, right? Like to really move from a world where everybody were working within one big opaque box, never really have the best-in-class tooling for any area, to a world where web developers were working on the UI as its own application with its own set of tools and using all these pluggable components from headless CMSs to payment engines to booking engines and so on. And where backend teams could focus on building like very company-specific services that the UI teams could build on top of. That was like the least probably the least technical I could get on a very, very technical term.
Yeah, so that probably resonated great with developers. How did that help with scaling Netlify? So
it was a really important part, and it was an important part of our journey. Like when we started out, people were like, we didn't invent doing this, right? Like it wasn't us that came up with the idea of separating things and so on, right?
You just gave it a name, or
we just saw that it was the right architecture for the future, and there were like relatively small groups doing it in very different areas of the ecosystem. So there were some groups focusing on what you call static site generators, like the idea of like pre-building all your pages up front and making them very fast and simple. And they had a little community around that, right? Like there were some people focusing on single page applications and like how you could build applications directly in the browser as a client and be closer to the architecture of mobile and so on. They had their community in a box. There was like sort of a whole notion of the API economy and a lot of talks around that, but it was not connected to these other communities, right? Like, so we were basically seeing that there was a red line through the landscape of all these different trends. And if we could give a name to this thing that was happening and give a nomenclature, that in itself would be really important about creating community around it and in making people realize, hey, we're not actually doing something in isolation. There's actually some red thread around this, and there's something like that. There's a real path to building a better web, right? Like, so for us, it was really important to articulate that and give it a name. And obviously, like, you search for different names and so on. Jamstack specifically, it came up like I was having red wine with a friend that worked at Uber at the time, and it was like, and it was back and forth, and like, we need a name for this thing, and we can't really figure it out. And it was actually this guy Andreas that said, like, how about something like, there was the lamp stack? How about something like a Jamstack? And then I was like, okay, if we called it Jamstack, it could be JavaScript API and markup. It kind of worked.
Reverse engineering, basically.
I reverse engineered, came up with that, and then Chris, my co-founder, and I, we had like I remember we were having beers with Tom Preston Werner, who started GitHub and was an early angel investor and so on, and we were saying like one option would be to call it like Jamstack, but we don't really know internally, like, is it good enough and so on. And he was like, well, it's no worse than Ajax, right? Like, that was also like a weird abbreviation. And just the fact that someone put the name Ajax on that methodology sort of triggered the whole Web 2.0 in many ways, right? Like, so we sort of agreed there that, okay, it's gonna be good enough. And
do you remember some of the alternatives for the name?
At some point, someone suggested active websites compared to like the term dynamic websites. I didn't like it. It was too fluffy. We had, I don't know, we had different ones. But honestly, the only one I really remember now is Jamstack.
For a good reason.
Yeah.
So this is probably a great lesson for other scale-ups. Maybe they should think about creating a new name for something that already exists, or
I would,
or something.
So honestly, I would say if you can avoid it, don't, right? Like if someone already made the name, like then the category is already there, and you can ride the wave, right? Like it's always easier if you can find a wave to ride, because otherwise when you're doing category creation, it's very powerful, right? Like, but also you're suddenly in this weird situation where you're a small startup with limited resources, and now you have to in some way both do marketing for a category and for yourself, and it's hard enough to do one of them, right? Like, so there's definitely like trade-offs to doing it.
How did you brand Jamstack in the beginning?
Very light branding, very developer-ish, right? Like very community-driven. We consciously made sure that we didn't put a big like Netlify stamp on it or anything like that, right? Like we really worked.
Like it's bigger than Netlify.
It had to be bigger than us, right? Like, and it had to be not just us. We worked very methodically in the beginning on getting other companies and other people in the industry involved in the term and involved in the community and so on, right? Like, so it was always important for us that it was not like a Netlify thing, but that it was an actual like web architecture thing.
Yeah.
We were essentially generating a wave that both us and others could ride, right? Like, and that's why I'm saying if we had spotted a wave that was already there, we would definitely just have like jumped on it, right? Like, but in this case, we felt like to make all of these changes in what we truly believed would improve the web happen, right? Like, we didn't need some category that didn't exist.
Was there skepticism from developers when they saw like Jamstack in the beginning, where what made them realize, it's not just Netlify, that you were trying to build something for the community?
I think I think you can't really fake it, right? Like I think we're just genuine about really building a community that was larger than us from the beginning, right? Like I think that was probably the key point to it. If like I've seen other companies try to do the same thing and just really try to insert themselves in the center of it like all the time, and it doesn't work, right? Like you can't, like if you do that, everybody else is like, wait,
You cannot fool
like
them.
I don't want to be the thing in the periphery of your thing, right? Like so you got it from the beginning, be really genuine about wanting it to be bigger than your own company, otherwise it won't work.
When you say like not being in the center, what do you think the difference would be from what you did with Jamstack and maybe someone else would do with that didn't work?
I mean, I've even seen companies
Beyond the like putting the
like
logo.
coined it like coined a term and then made like a market diagram with themselves like big in the center, right? Like, and then all these other companies as part of the category, and it's like, why do you think anybody want to join the community if you're telling them there's some periphery thing to you, right? Like you can't do that, right? Like, and I've seen it's incredible how often I've seen that mistake happen, because people want to be at the center of a category. I get it, right? Like, but if you want to create a category, you have to put your own ego aside, and you have to be like, is this actually bigger than us? And are we a part of it, or are we just trying to create a community around us? If you're just trying to do that, just try to do that. Don't call it something else.
Netlify stack. So okay, so you have Jamstack, like working out, community building from it. But there were other factors, obviously, that helped like set up the whole scaling. Was it the free plan that you had? Was it something else? What made that scaling in the beginning easier and made you successful?
We had this very clear mental model that this was like a traditional, the whole traditional disrupting journey, right? Like that starts with innovators, early adopters, and so on, right? Like, so Chris and I kind of sat down and made a list of the 20 most important people and companies in the space that we wanted to somehow get to like show what we're building.
Okay.
And at least half of them should think it was a good idea. Otherwise, like we would be doing something wrong. Because if we went to the wrong, like if we had this thesis that this architectural change was happening and there were people already doing some of it and so on, and we were building like the solution they would need to really make it great, and we got in front of all of them and they were all like, that doesn't seem useful. Then we were probably then we should probably rethink like what are we doing with our lives basically, right? But we got in front of them, right? Like, and a lot of them became like involved in the community or became early investors and so on, right? Like, then we really worked with this model of like concentric circles, right? Like, how does these things spread from like the very first adopters, influencers to the next group of more connected people and further out in the community, and thought very much about like how to reach each of those groups, right? Like if you're starting out at a new startup and is saying like we want to reach all developers everywhere equally, right? Like you good luck with that, right? Like, but if you start up and say I have these 20 people and I want them to know about me, that's doable, right? Like you can probably find some way to harass them enough that they pay attention and are like, okay, I'll take a coffee with you.
That's true.
And if you keep thinking about the segments in that way, I think it helps in that early journey. And then the other thing was very product centric, right? Like was really thinking about like this product as a product led motion where we thought in the first stages, I put a lot of thought into like what is a developer in that group we want to reach? What is the weekend project that they'll sit down when they want to learn new technologies over a weekend, or they want to build something? What's the kind of thing they would build with Netlify that we could make like a really great experience that would also teach them something that they could then take to work and say like, hey, I just did this thing with Netlify and we're doing this thing now.
We could use it for...
Why don't we use Netlify for it, right? Like the first thing we kind of ended up focusing on there was kind of just the typical developer blog. Okay. And developer blogs are funny because like you work with a lot of developers writing content, right? Like, and I think lots of developers, they want to have their blog and their name out there, but they don't really want to write the content.
So we're used to that.
so you have that tendency to find a new system to build a blog with, build a blog and build one blog post that's about, I built my new blog in XYZ, and then maybe you never see another piece of content until they rebuild it, right? Like, so we really wanted to give them the tools to build that interesting new blog, and that first blog post of like, wow, I built my blog with XYZ. Yeah, hello world. And we sort of really...
You're doing the wrong thing, but great.
But great.
It's with the right tool.
That's the most important thing, yeah.
And you will learn about how to build with this approach, right? Like you will learn about what Netlify can do and what this architecture can do for you. And you'll suddenly end up with a blog that's like hosted on a global edge network with amazing performance, with incredible uptime properties, like with a incredible release management and rollback features, and that could potentially be great to collaborate with other developers on through GitHub and so on, right? Like, so hey, maybe if at work you're launching a campaign site and you've just done this over your weekend, you would be like, hey, just use this tool over to build my blog. And I wrote a blog post on it about it, by the way, right? Like, how about
that one blog post?
That one blog post, right? Like, how about we actually go use the same for this new campaign? It would give us much better performance, reliability, everything, right? Like, that was kind of like the first like adoption loop we sort of thought about. The other early thing was, before we always had a free plan, but in the early days it was actually like we give a lot more away for free now than we did early on, right? Like early on, if you wanted to put a custom domain on a site, you had to pay for the site. And our pro plan in the early days was like, I think at a bit more feature level, it was like $49 a month per site, right? Like when we had that plan, we introduced on the pricing page an open source plan that would give you all the same for free if you are open source. It's a very strong signal that not just, it wasn't just a free plan, right? Like it was like, if you were open source, we would kind of give you $49 a month per site for free, right?
You were
like,
supporting the community, basically.
So it felt even more valuable than just the free plan, right? And that was also important to reach, like the open source community, the open source adopters, and get it into their hands and so on. And then after we raised our Series A, we made our free plan much broader than it was at that point, gave even more weight to the community, right? Like, and really started just driving that broad adoption with the goal of like, hey, we want developers to know Netlify and to have it in their tool belt.
So those early investors, you mentioned that some of the people that you talked in the beginning became investors and so on. Were the early investors also developers that understood the concept? Was it the business pitch, a tech pitch? Especially with this specific, especially with this specific approach, did they understand it, or were you looking just for investors that would understand this approach?
I think especially early on, you want investors that gets what you do. Like early on, getting on investors that don't get what you do, it might give you some cash, but it'll also give you massive like communication issues and like how are you going to be really aligned on, like early on, right? Like you don't have the business model yet. You typically have a very big vision for how like the future would look like, and very small proof points that you could potentially make that happen, right? Like, and you need investors that understand that journey and understands what you're doing. And we were fortunately, I mean, we got really great people on board. So the first investors were our angel investors that committed to the round, that were people like Tom Preston Werner that started GitHub, or Adam Wiggins that started Heroku, or Todd Morey that started Rackspace Cloud, and so on, right? Like, and then we got like a small fund that's called Inc. Today, just mainly driven by one person that's also himself a developer and gets the space. And then Bloomberg Beta, that really got what we were doing. James and Roy there were amazing to work with, right? Like, and put our first seed round together. And the seed round for sure was the hardest round we put together, right? Like lots of no's, lots of people that didn't get it, lots of people that said like, this thing, like, this is not a market, it's not going to happen, and so on. But the important thing was finding the people that got it, right? Like, and that understood it, and get them on board.
Was getting those developers slash investors also similar to other developers in terms of, okay, if these guys and gals understand it, like getting
yeah, of course, of course, there's some proof point there. I don't think, in reality, in the bigger scope of building, like, adoption and so on, none of your investors will really make, like, that's not what's going to make your difference, right? Like, they'll like racing around and so on will give you a brief moment to communicate that and create some SEO around it and so on, but it's not something you shouldn't overestimate, like, those kind of effects. Like, the effects are more behind the scenes on, like, having access to people that have built things like this before and have tried it before and that understand the space and can guide you in your journey as a founder and can help you see around some of the corners and so on. That's the real value in my opinion.
Talking more about your journey. So both you and your co-founder are from Denmark,
Yeah.
but you started Netlify as a US company.
Yeah.
So now there's been a conversation in like, let's say European tech space about, like, can tech companies be started in the EU? Most famously, the co-founder of Stripe relatively recently said that they wouldn't be able to start Stripe in the EU. They're Irish originally, and they started in the US. What are your thoughts on this? Like, if you want to start a tech company like Netlify, like Stripe, do you need to start in the US? Why?
I mean, there's never any absolutes, right? Like, like, Contentful started in Germany, and Storyblok is in Germany, and so on, right? Like, there's absolutely examples of people building really cool companies and really cool products out of Europe, right? Like, just as anywhere else. And the US is not just the US, right? Like, but the Silicon Valley, the Bay Area, and the concentration there of investors and talent and optimism and willingness to take really big bets is very unique, right? Like, and it will, if you are optimizing for the biggest chance of realizing, like, a really big vision in a venture-backed way, there is no better place to do it, right? Like, that is, like, if you really want to optimize for that, you should go there, right? Like, that doesn't mean you can't do it somewhere else, right? Like, it's just like, if that is what you optimize for, the concentration of talent, investors, of, like, ecosystem around you, of people that will push you to be more ambitious instead of less, of people that, instead of saying, when they hear your idea, oh, there's this problem and how is it going to be profitable, or how it's going to say, oh wow, if it works, like, how big can you make it, right? Like, where can you take it? If that's what you optimize for, go. Like, the Bay Area is just, like, I haven't seen anything that compares to it, right? Like, again, that doesn't mean you can't do it in Europe. It's just not as optimized for it. And when I look, I was already in the Bay Area when we started Netlify, and kind of convinced Chris to stop having a well-paid job back in Denmark and move to the most expensive city in the world with his family, and stop having a salary and so on. There was a lot of, like, red wine in Sonoma involved, I think.
I'm still constant with the red wine.
But I think what I saw there coming from Europe, one of the things was the optimism, where I think in Europe, for many good reasons, we've built a bit more of a relation to technology that's constant, that's very fear-based, and a general cynicism that you will meet more if you're thinking about starting something or building something that's more risk averse, and that's more about all the ways it could fail and all the things that could go wrong and all the things we should, like, think about. And if you go to San Francisco and to the Bay Area and you start, like, talking about ideas, you're met by a very different attitude of, like, what if, and here's other people that have done something similar, and, like,
different energy.
That was a part of it, right? Like, and I think that permeates deeper into the whole ecosystem around it, where if you talk to European investors and funds, they will think much more about like, what do you need to do in the next 4 years to make a profitable company that has a balanced balance sheet and looks like a healthy business. And if you talk to the best funds in Silicon Valley, they will be, what is your vision for building a multi-billion-dollar company? And how can you connect that somehow to reality? Show there's some probability, right? Like of you going and doing that. And that's what they want to bet on, and that's what they want to push you to do, right? Like, and those are two very different motions from the beginning, right? Like if from, and they're not right and wrong, right? Like they're very big risks to building in sort of the Silicon Valley based growth way, right? Like you have much better, like much larger risks of suddenly imploding, or like there's a lot of things that can go wrong. There can be a lot of advantages even to founders to build like in a very conservative way and say like, let's just focus on getting a healthy business and grow it in a quiet way, and maybe even in that way maintain more ownership or whatever, right? Like, but at the same time, if you look at the two methods sort of holistically, you will see that almost all like the $100 billion companies that's been built in the last decades are in the US, right?
Well, let's talk about a bit more about those cultural differences and cynicism, as you
Yeah,
mentioned, because I listened to one of your interviews where you talk about setting up corporate values, which
yeah,
is a really American corporate thing to do,
yeah.
but still you did it for Netlify.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember we had definitely some conversations internally at first where two Danes, we were like, these corporate values, that's just like bullshit. Why would we do that? Values of what we do and whatever, right? Like, but I think you learn along the way that no matter what you do, your company is going to have some values, like that's going to happen in any group you create, right? Like, and it grows out organically and so on, right? Like, and you can choose whether you want to try to be somewhat intentional and explicit around those values, or whether you just want them to happen by accident, right? Like, and once you think about it in that way, it becomes obvious that okay, if you can channel something into strengthening the parts of the culture that you think is healthy for your business, and focusing on those, it makes it more easy to create intentionality. And like when you're hiring new people, what are the points that you should focus on in terms of values when you're promoting people or growing people, or when managers are taking initiatives? How are the way they should, that you want them to think as a leader about the culture they're creating, right? Like, and especially as you scale the company, this, when you're small enough that there's no layers of management and so on, it's more of a like, who cares, right? Like you can manage that directly. But once you start getting larger and distributed and different managers and different cultures and everything, right? Like having some guidelines for like how do we intentionally want to build our cultures, that's becoming really, really important.
Going from corporate values to personal values. So your co-founder unfortunately had to battle cancer at one point, and thankfully won out on that. But I'm sure that that was a very hard time, both obviously for him, but also for you and the company. Now I'm asking this because there's unfortunately a lot of cases of, well, those relationships not working out, and a lot of founders basically getting pushed out because of their health issues and so on. What are your thoughts on those types of like really human challenges along the way of like creating a business?
Yeah, it's never easy. Like this happened actually before the inception of Netlify, and was kind of part of the inception, right? Like, so Chris and I, we've been really great friends since high school, and known, it feels like we've known each other forever, right? Like, I had moved to Spain, and Chris was in Denmark, and at one point he messaged me and said, I've been diagnosed with cancer and have Hopkins lymphoma, and it's one of those moments that really strikes you. Wow, you're like, one of your best friends could die, right? Like, so I took some extra time to go back to Denmark over the holidays and spend some time with Chris, right? Like, and get to spend time together. In that process, I just started like the predecessor to what became Netlify, and we started talking through all of these ideas and so on, and started helping out with like advice and thoughts and like how would you take this to market and so on, right? Like while he was fighting hard, right? Like going through chemo and radiation therapy and everything. We sort of really kept talking through that whole phase and like also in like optimism, right? Like we get out on the other end of this, then let's do something, right? Like and when he got out of the other end of this, he kind of pinged me and was like, I want to do the next thing in my life, right? Like and
Deal
we
is a
started
deal.
really we started really talking seriously about let's do that, right? Like, and I think it's one of those moments also where you remember the fragility of it all. You also get the sense of like, okay, am I doing the most I could be doing right now, right? Like,
Yeah.
and I think that was part of obviously also his very brave decision to leave Denmark to come join me to take a big risk, right? Like, and we sort of started with a big commitment of like, no matter what happens, this is
Yeah.
not like a fail fast. This is like we're gonna make it work kind of thing, right? Like, and started from there. In general, as it goes in founder relationships, it's really complex, right? Like, and again, there's simply no great rules. I've I've seen founders that have tried to stay in their seat even at a point where they were kind of miserable,
Mm-hmm.
stepped out and then fundamentally were much better off for it, right? Like, and I think it's part of what you got to look at as a founder, like what you've got to be careful of making what you're doing all of your identity and remembering that like you're still just a full person, whether you're in the company you founded or outside of it. And then as founders really focus on like all the time, like, are we doing the right thing for the business, right? Like, are we doing what grows the largest in the end? Hopefully as founder you're like the largest, some of the largest shareholders in your company, right? Like so you want it to fundamentally do really well.
But some founders still like can't think of themselves beyond anything than being the CEO of the startup that now has grown.
I know.
What would you like maybe suggest to them, like how to think about these?
I have felt I've definitely had periods where I've fallen into that and so on, right? Like, and I think it is really important to pull yourself out of that or find someone that can help pull you out of it and remember, look, you're not your company, right? Like,
It's so hard.
it's so hard, right? Like, but in the end, whoever you are, you're like a human being, a full person and so on, right? Like, and the company is a company, right? Like it's not at the root who you are. And I think the moment you internalize that and get that sense of like, I'm the CEO of this company, but I am not the company, right? Like, or I'm the CTO or whatever role you have, right? Like the moment you remember, like, the better you can internalize that, the better you'll also be in that role, because like the more you will be able to say, okay, in this role, what is the right thing to do? Am I still enjoying this role? Is it still fun for me? Is it still what I want to do? Is it still what I'm great at? And so on. The role can change over time, and I've definitely seen founders that along the way they feel such an identity that they don't want to admit it, but they kind of hate what they're doing, right? Like, I've definitely seen that, right? Like, and at that point it's much better to like find like, go hire someone else to do the role, right? Like, why not? So I think like the more you can get back to remembering the person you are is not the role you have, the better you'll be at that role and the better decisions you'll take for that role.
One of the decisions you made is to create a distributed company.
Yeah.
Is it remote first?
Yeah, I mean, so from the beginning we had a hybrid culture, right? Like we had an office in the Dogpatch area of San Francisco, but started hiring remotely very early on. And even from the beginning, we had the rule that anyone in the office worked from home Tuesdays and Thursdays,
Okay, 2 days.
2 days a week. And it was not so much, it wasn't so much like you can work from home 2 days a week as like we want everybody to work from home Tuesday and Thursday. So we build a remote first culture, a distributed culture, as we called it, right? Like, because if you don't build it from the beginning and you have a hybrid culture, it's very hard to be remote,
Yeah.
right? Like, then during the pandemic, we gave up the lease on our office. And for a while, we didn't have one at all, and we were fully distributed. Now we are back to having, like since the end of last year, a small office in San Francisco and a small office in Portland. Started using them for offsites and, well, now I guess now they are on-sites again, on-sites and get-togethers for teams and so on. And I'm also starting to bring some people together on a very regular basis at the San Francisco office. But with the same mentality, right? Like, we're building a distributed company, a distributed culture, but I have found that it's still very valuable to have spaces of your own and to have the ability to go into a space and to be able to do cross-organizational things, like bring in people leadership level from R&D and go to market and in a space together. We're also starting to really figure out that for a while we would give teams budgets to do like team offsites to bond. Instead, we've tried to really rethink it into functional offsite and say, like, if there's something you want to get done with a group of people, you get budget to go do that together, rather than just like sit in a room with your team. And I think that's also where I'm hearing from some of those teams, when if you have a hard problem and you just get the right set of people, and sometimes it's not one team, right? Like, sometimes it's cross-functional and so on. If you get the right people in a room for a week, you can make the kind of progress that you just can't make remotely, right? Like, then on the other hand, if you're sitting and doing your work and you need to focus and so on, like at distributed setting, it's typically like the best for everyone there, right? Like, you optimize your workplace for you. You can have focus, you can have intensity and so on.
You probably communicate with your users with email, just like Netlify, but do you use SMS, WhatsApp, Apple Messages? Our Info messaging platform is built for companies just like yours. Companies like Meta, HubSpot, and Uber use it all day for all their users. More in the description below.
So we have one last question for you, one last set of questions regarding your career. For most of your career, you've been programmer, CTO, technical co-founder, CEO, but you actually started as a music journalist.
Yeah, I had a career before all of this.
How did that happen? Why you actually studied musicology?
Yeah. I as every tech founder, of course, I took a bachelor in musicology and comparative literature and started a master's in cultural studies. The thing you do. And I mean, it's funny. I started programming on the Commodore 64 when I was like 10, 11 years old, right? And got really bitten by it, right? Like, it was just so amazing that you could create things that kind of had reality that you could interact with in this computer thing, right? Like, but this, like, at a time where it was not like no one would look around and see like some normal career path as a developer and so on, right? Like, my family was mainly out of like the arts and music and so on. My mother taught ear training. She's a pianist and taught ear training at the conservatory. My dad was a radio producer and presenter and had like a regular program about contemporary classical music, and they were both very active in that whole ecosystem and everything, right? Like, so I think a lot of my family would like come to them and they would see like, Mathias is spending so much time just alone on the computer. What's gonna happen to him? It's like deeply worried. Yeah. But I did also at some point on my own get really bitten by playing piano.
Okay.
And playing classical piano, and decided to enroll in musicology. And after my bachelor, when I was doing my master's in cultural studies, I started working. I got an internship at the Danish radio, working as working on the music, editorial music part of their website. Started becoming like a musical journalist after that. After my internship ended, I became a freelancer. I became a freelance editor for the site and so on. Had some amazing experiences together with Chris covering when I was covering the Copenhagen Jazz Festival, which is one of the largest jazz festivals in the world, with like 900 concerts in 10 days. And
Nice.
I think my record was going to 40 concerts in 10 days,
Oh my
writing writing 3 articles a day based on them. And I dragged Chris to a lot of those, and he enjoyed it a lot. We had a lot of fun. But it was pretty intense. So very different background. Through the whole thing, my biggest procrastination and hobby was programming computers and building stuff and so on, right? Like, so at a point I met a girl from Madrid, went to Madrid to see her. She came, saw me. I went there a bit longer. I decided, okay, I'm going to go there for like 3 months and finish up my master's thesis.
Mm-hmm.
And then after a couple of months, I was like, okay, this is going to be more than 3 months. And also, the market for writing about music in Danish in Madrid, it's not.
It's a niche.
It's not that big a TAM. Like, let's put it that way. And especially when you don't speak a word of Spanish on top of it, it's like there was not a lot of like opportunity in that path. So I just started building stuff, and I started showing it to people. And at a point, I got hired working remotely for a Denver-based startup, and then later on stumbled randomly into some people at a conference in Madrid, and got a coffee with the founder of their company. And he over that first coffee presented me with a job offer to come work for them. It's like, okay, let me think about it for a moment here. Started there as a senior developer, and then somehow within a span of 2 years or so went from senior developer to tech lead to director of technology and to CTO of the company.
So
Yeah.
my question was, you're obviously a self-taught developer.
Yeah.
Were you ever self-conscious about it? But
Yeah. I mean,
got a senior role immediately.
I mean, so this was the funny thing. Like the girl I met in Madrid, like we ended up getting married, spent 14 years together, and she was actually a software architect when I met her. I'd always been doing all this programming, and all the time when I was doing it and working on stuff and building things and so on, I never charged for it or anything. I always just thought, like, I'm just a hobbyist, and there's these real programmers out there that actually know what they're doing, and I'm just like trying to figure stuff out and reading on the internet and so on. Like, who am I, right? Like,
It's a hobby.
It's a hobby, right? Like, and when I started to get to know like more and more real programmers, I would always come and be like, "Hey, have you heard about this new thing?" and so on. And like, a lot of them would like be like some Java developer at a bank. They're just like, "No, I never heard about that. What's that?" and so on, right? Like, and I slowly started to recognize, wait, there isn't really any real programmers out there that fundamentally knows what they're doing. Everybody's just figuring out their shit. Like, so at that point, I slowly like built my confidence. It's like, hey, I'm actually like I'm as good as figuring stuff out as any of them, and let me just go build stuff and see what I can do. That's kind of at the heart of software development, right? Like, it's such a new discipline in the broad scope of things, right? Like, and it changes so fast, right? Like, if you're still trying. Imagine you're trying to do front-end development today, and you're trying to do it with the same technology you used 10 years ago, right? Like, you would not be able to get a job, right? Like, it's like everything has changed, right? Like, React wasn't there, Go wasn't there, the TypeScript wasn't there. Like, as a developer, the core thing you have to be good at is to constantly learn and adapt, right? Like, and then you've got to focus on learning some key like fundamentals that don't change, right? Like algorithms and data structures and so on, right? Like, if you understand those well, you have some ballast that will carry through all the changes. But that's why I think I've made, like, when I've hired for Netlify, I've never, I could not tell you what education any of our developers have. Like, it's simply not something I've looked at, right?
Mhm.
Like
Obviously.
what matters is like what have they built and what and are they great at learning and adapting, and are they curious and do they get it right? Like, so I think to your question, in short, yeah, early on for sure, I had a lot of imposter syndrome, and I was like, what is this? When I had my first job as a paid developer, I was also constantly like, hey, when are they gonna figure out that I'm like just doing what I like to do for fun, and they're somehow paying me money for it? Like, what's happening here, right? Like, but over time, I also just recognized that look, there isn't any other way to be a really good developer than just be very self-driven, motivated, and curious, and somewhat stubborn.
Is music still an important part of your life?
It is. It is. It's still an important part of my life. It's sort of the one big treat I bought for myself is like a Steinway grand piano. And it's not that I'm a fantastic pianist or anything, but it's still one of the key ways for me to like for some others it might be meditation or anything, but for me those moments of just sitting down with a classical piece, learning it, it's like a part of you that involves like that requires this like you can't do that while you're thinking about work and everything, right? Like you have to somewhat step into a different mental space that involves a lot of both like logic and practice and discipline, but also emotion and listening and so on, right? Like so, it's still a very important piece for
Is
me.
it similar to programming?
Um, there are some there are some similarities, less between playing, but there is, especially in classical music. I've often said that like the classical composers were the first programmers in many ways, right? Like they would write this like algorithm over time that you would give to, in this case, not a computer, but like a symphony orchestra or something like that to be executed, right? Like, and you would have to be able to hold that structure and all these moving pieces in your head over time. And I think that ability to sort of hold that kind of abstract space in your head is very similar between music and between programming. And I think that's why you'll see a lot of overlap between like I have seen a lot of overlap between good programmers and music. And I think it comes from that same ability to hold like abstract structures in your mental space.
Well, Matt, thank you for your time. It was really interesting.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching this interview with Mathias. If you want to watch the interview with the founder of Tenderly, who raised over $50 million, click on the link.